Welcome, we're joined by political consultant, CivilNet host and commentator Eric Hacopian. We'll be discussing the recent offensives in Nagorno-Karabakh and the recent political developments in Armenia. Eric, thank you for your time again.
It's a pleasure.
So offensives were relaunched by Azerbaijan in the Khazabert and Hindhagher area. Russian peacekeepers are now there. What would skirmishes or a relaunching of offensives and hostilities mean for Armenia, but also what would that mean for Russia?
Well, I think what people need to understand is in the Hadrut region that we lost in the 90th percentile during the war. Hadrut was it's a part of actual Karabakh proper. It's not any of the formerly liberated, occupied territories. There were 2 or 3 villages left there, and they were left in some of a strategic location, which was actually in the mountains, which overlooked the rest of Hadrut. And this particular area, unlike other areas in Artsakh, were not protected up until a couple of days ago by Russian peacekeepers, which opened up the possibility of an Azeri offensive in that area and trying to clear that area out, considering that there were no Russian peacekeepers. The one thing that we do know is where there are Russian peacekeepers, it's almost no fighting and general stability, and people are going back to their lives. In fact, there's a couple of hundred people a day that go back to Artsakh on a daily basis and whatever their villages and Stepanakert in different places. But to be honest with you, this just shows utter unbelievable incompetence on the part of both the Armenian government and the Artsakh government, because this area, the war ended 5 weeks ago, or nearly 5 weeks ago, and no one raised the issue of why the peacekeepers are not in that particular location when it's probably the most strategic location and the most important place for them to guard. It's unbelievable to me. Like, what is the government of Artsakh doing? What is the foreign ministry of Armenia doing? What is the prime minister of Armenia doing in not raising a stink about this? And so we have the situation where 2 of these villages have been taken over by the other side, while at the same time in the current Russian peacekeeper map, actually these areas have been extended as part of their mission. But there's tremendous, it's unclear. What does that mean? Does that mean that our forces can go back there? It's total lack of clarity, and it's just another sign of complete incompetence on the side of this government and of our state in general, and Artsakh in particular, because after all, these are their territories.
And as for talk of elections, the Deputy President of the National Assembly, Armen Sarkissian, kind of hinted at the possibility of snap parliamentary elections, but Pashinyan so far has not really. Do you think it's becoming more and more likely that snap elections will be held?
I don't know. It depends on what you mean by snap elections. If you mean elections in a month or 2 weeks, I doubt that. I mean immediate elections. I don't see that. Is it likely that we're going to have elections sometimes next year? I think it's quite probable that we're going to have elections sometimes next year, because there's just too much angst, too much political pressure, too much demand for change on many parts of on the part of too many people. So eventually it'll have to come to that. But so far he's the only one who's mentioned it. But what I mean by that, he's the only one who's mentioned it inside of the government. But I can totally see that. The political situation, as far as who stays and who goes, is such that we could have the current situation for 6 months, or in 48 hours you can have drastic change. It's very hard to tell. I think what's key for people to understand is, for people who are, the Nicolistas, they need to acknowledge the fact that he bears a good part of responsibility for the predicament that we're at. And for people who think that him going away is going to solve our problems, they're also a bit delusional, because our problems are so much deeper, so much structural, and based on lack of competence on a state level. Because 98% of people in government do not leave. They're here no matter what government is here. They survive all kinds of governments. What we have is incompetence and failure in our state sector, on our military sector, and until we get to the deep root causes of that, changing a government here or there, it'll have some effect, but it won't fundamentally change things.
And as for the President of the Republic, Armen Sarkissian, he has now met with former President Robert Kocharyan and former President Serge Sarkisian and has had talks with Vazgen Manukyan, who is the opposition street protest movement's prime ministerial candidate. He has also called for governmental change. What do you think of his tactics? And moreover, do you think he's attempting to go for the position of prime minister eventually?
Well, of course. I think it's very clear he wants to be prime minister. And frankly, if he would have acted in the correct way right after the war ended, he could have actually had a chance of being some kind of a consensus person, because we do have polling from before the election that made him the most popular elected official in Armenia. So obviously, not him not being directly responsible for the war will tell you that, or he's perceived to be not to be directly responsible for the war, would mean that he probably has kept a good part of that popularity. The problem for him is, since the war has ended, he has essentially taken one wrong step after another. Instead of reassuring people about that he's going to have this reformist government he's going to bring in the best people from every walk of life, from inside of Armenia, outside of Armenia, and sort of introducing them that this is going to be my government. He has spent 5 weeks essentially meeting with every discredited figure in this country and people who have absolutely no support in the public. So I don't understand what his approach is. But so far, I don't think it's getting him anywhere. Up until 2 days ago, well, he was the first person that called out the government about the Hadrut situation, which I think was smart. But unfortunately, I haven't seen anything from his camp or from him that to think that his attempt at coming to power has been anything but a fail up to this point.
And what do you think about calls for a technocratic government, which the president has talked about? Some are even calling for diasporans to be in the new government, to head certain ministries. The AGBU, which is a major international Armenian organization, has called for Pashinyan to resign. Both the Catholic KOI have called for the prime minister to resign. What do you make of this calls from the diaspora?
Well, there's absolutely nothing wrong with first of all, people speaking their mind. They have every right to say what they're going to say. If nothing, as an institution, as individual Armenians, they have a right to say what they're going to say. There's nothing wrong about calling for a technocratic government, even though you have to be careful with that. Sometimes that's a word for an undemocratic government, but let's just assume that that's not what they're going at. There's nothing wrong with bringing the best possible people to deal with the country's issues at a moment of crisis. So that's all good. But there's another part of this, which is that these outside forces, saying things that what should happen politically inside of Armenia. There's always a place for a moral voice. People who are outside of the political scene to come and comment in very rare instances when a moral voice is needed. To go back into our own history, someone like Catholic Vazgen, was a moral voice and someone that people respected because he was seen as being morally consistent. So in order to be a moral voice that will have credibility and people will listen to, you have to have been consistent over the years. That means you called whatever was wrong, no matter who was doing it, for 30 years. Unfortunately, these individuals and institutions have not done that. So because they have not been a consistent moral voice in calling out what's been wrong for 30 years, the response to their call has been rather muted or somewhat negative, because the easy and the most prompt answer is that, well, where were you in 28 years of falsified elections and corruption? The world didn't start in May of 2018. So I think so far, because they lack that consistent, moral standing, their calls have pretty much not led to much of anything.
But do you not think these are like high institutions of the country which are almost breaking a convention of impartiality in a sense?
Oh, they are. They are. I mean, listen, there's an element that this government, for its strengths or weakness, it's not an establishmentarian figure. And there was a lot of people, especially in the diaspora, that were quite comfortable dealing with the old regime. Life was a lot easier for them, but the world has moved on. There's also an internal bias against Pashinyan inside of Armenia, just because he's not part of the Yerevansi elite. He's seen as this outside, rogue figure who plays cheap populist games. So there's also this class element of people who don't like him and his followers. But we don't need to go there. I just think bottom line is what they have tried to influence, they really haven't. It hasn't really moved the needle.
Okay. And finally, I want to talk about Azerbaijan and Turkey. Both Erdogan and Aliyev have been making quite threatening remarks, using quite incendiary rhetoric. In Azerbaijan, there is a lot of talk going around about claims on Syunik, the region of Syunik, which is in Armenia proper. Aliyev said to the OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs that he would smash the head of Armenian fascism. Some thought that maybe when this war ends, these men would take a conciliatory tone. What do you think is going on here?
Listen, first of all, some of the things that they have said, stuff that they have said over the years, this is nothing new, especially Aliyev. This is just claims on Yerevan, Sevan, and claims on all of Armenia. This is nothing new, frankly. It's just more pointed because of the situation that we're in. I think there's two audiences here. A part of this is just red meat for their internal audience. And then it's to show, to rev up their nationalist cards even further. And secondly, I think there's the foreign audience, and the foreign audience is us, for the most part. And they're trying to do is to cause intimidation and to cause either despair or panic among Armenians in Armenia and around the world. And we shouldn't fall for their games. As a practical matter, because of Armenia's long-term defense relationships with Russia and the guarantee of security that we have, all of these things are fantastic notions that are never going to come about. I mean, the Turkish-Armenian border since 1920 hasn't been crossed by anyone. And so there's an element of this which is farcical in nature. And it's not, they can say it because they can't do it, or they know that they can't do it, and they're never going to go there. But they can use it to destabilize our internal politics and drive people crazy, and they've actually done a good job of that. On this Syunik issue, there's a bit of this Turkish yellow journalism. There's actually good press sources in Turkey, except they've pretty much all been put in prison by Erdogan, or they're in exile. So you have this, people pick up things from the Turkish press, and there was this ridiculous TV program in which, Azerbaijan is going to sue Armenia for $50 billion, and since Armenia doesn't have $50 billion, they'll have to give up Syunik, which is ridiculous because in the history of the world, no lawsuit has ever led to any country giving up territory to anybody else. And what court they would do this in is not, they don't even talk about, because if you ever set up a court like this, the Afghans can sue half the world, the French will be in lawsuits forever. So this is a bit of a ridiculous notion, and you have people who either don't know how ridiculous the Turkish press can be, or for the purposes of causing more dissension in Hayastan, they pick these things up and they blow it up out of proportion, but these things really have very little to do with reality.
Well, Eric, thank you as always.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.